Hi, everybody. So the last video introduced the idea of the principle of humanity, and it actually hinted at a few advantages, but this video is going to look specifically at some of the advantages and try to develop them in a bit more detail of the principle of humanity. So we'll briefly review what the principle of humanity is, and then we'll jump into the advantages. We'll talk about how it explains the immorality of a fanatic, how it explains the immorality of slavery and rape, how it explains our outrage at paternalism, its ability to explain why it's okay to never abandon hope in people, how it can provide a basis for universal human rights, and how it can make sense of our ideas of moral responsibility, praise, and punishment. So the principle of humanity says always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. A human being, remember, is anything that has rationality and autonomy. Now we think Homo sapiens have rationality and autonomy, the ability to reason and the ability to use that reason to assess their own choices and make their own, control their own choices. But if we ever meet an alien that has rationality and autonomy, they would also qualify as a human being in this moral sense that Kant was using. Now, to treat a human being as an end is to treat them in a way that gives them the respect that they deserve, that appreciates and recognizes the value that that person's life has in virtue of having rationality and autonomy. To treat a human being as a means is to treat them in a way of using them as help for achieving some other goal you have. Now remember, to treat a human being as a mere means is to treat them as nothing more than a means. Now, I think it might actually be good to distinguish between degrees. Like, it's possible that maybe you show someone some of the respect they deserve, but not all of it. And so Kant's principle of humanity might actually be improved if we were able to maybe modify it in a way such that we could talk about degrees of wrongness in terms of if you treat them not maybe merely as a means, but maybe you treat them mostly as a means. Now, I think that's a tricky thing to do, but it's something for all of you to consider. Maybe that's something you could try to do. All right, so the principle of humanity, one advantage that it has is it explains the immorality of the fanatic's actions. So remember, this was a big problem for the principle of universalizability. Because a fanatic is someone who's devoted, overly devoted to a single cause. So they're single-mindedly pursuing this one goal. I mean, we talk about sports fanatics, who are just obsessed with this one thing. But sometimes fanatics are devoted single-mindedly to a really evil cause, like the Nazi fanatic. Now, the Nazi fanatic, they might be so single-mindedly devoted to their goals that they would be willing to apply their principles consistently among the population. In fact, if everyone were to adopt their maxims and principles, it'd make them achieving their goals even easier. Well, even if the fanatic is able to consistently apply their maxims to everyone, they're still using the other person merely as a means to achieving their goal. They're willing to stomp over that other person if it means it's going to help them achieve this goal that they are fanatical about. So they're willing to, no matter who it hurts or what it does, they're willing to send someone to the gas chamber if it helps them achieve their goal. And that means they are treating that other person as a mere means. It doesn't matter if they will apply their principles consistently. Now, in most cases, we tend to think of a fanatic as having terrible goals. However, someone could be a fanatic that's singularly, single-mindedly devoted to achieving a goal that we think is good. At any cost, they're willing to get this good goal. But it's interesting to note that this would be true, that it'd be the principle of humanity would explain that it's wrong for the fanatic to do this, even when the goals are good, because you would still be using them as a mere means. Notice this is kind of what happens in the organ harvesting case. The goal of saving more lives is a good goal. We can get behind that goal. But when someone is sort of single-mindedly, sort of fanatically pursuing the goal of saving as many lives as they can, and they're willing to sort of take someone else's organs without their consent in order to achieve that goal, it looks like they are treating that other person merely as a means to achieving their goals. And so it's not okay, even if they had good goals in mind. The Principle of Humanity also explains why slavery and rape are always and absolutely immoral. So notice that he is, look, utilitarianism can explain why slavery and rape are immoral. But it's not clear that their explanation is as good as Kant's, because according to utilitarianism, the reasons slavery and rape are wrong are because of the bad consequences, the pain, misery, and suffering that is caused by these practices. But when we think about these actions, we think, look, even if in the weird hypothetical scenario, very different than our own world, even if somehow putting people in slavery led to better consequences, which it doesn't, but if it did in a crazy scenario, often, still there'd be something ridiculously wrong with slavery, even in that scenario. Similarly, when you think about sort of rape, it's not just the consequences. Yes, look, the pain and suffering and sort of damage that's done to a person's psyche and to their loved ones, that seems to be really, really bad. But it seems like there's something about the very nature of the action itself. And utilitarianism can't explain what's wrong with the action itself, since there's nothing immoral in an action except for its consequences. On Kant's view, slavery treats a person without regard for their own goals and hopes. It fails to respect their value as a rational and autonomous being. It fails to give them control over how they are going to live their own lives. And so it violates the very thing that gives them sort of human dignity. It violates their autonomy. Similarly with rape, rape treats a person as nothing more than an object to be used for one's own gratification. It's a violation, an intimate violation of one's own personhood. It has no regard for that person's own desires and reasons and choices. And so there violates their very humanity. So independently, we don't have to look at the consequences to figure out that this is wrong. It's in the nature of the action that it's a violation of that person's personhood. And that's why it's wrong, and always wrong, regardless of what the consequences turn out to be on Kant's view. And that strikes a lot of people as a better explanation for why we find slavery and rape to be so incredibly morally atrocious. The Principle of Humanity also explains our outrage at paternalism. So paternalism is when someone assumes the rights and privileges of a parent, but instead of towards a child, towards an adult. Paternalism has us limit the liberty of others for their own good against their will. The book gives the example of the roommate and TV, where the roommate decides, you know what, this person is watching too much television and it's sort of hurting their grades and their sort of study habits. So while they're away at class, I'm going to take their TV and I'm going to go sell it. That is, they've made the choice for their sort of roommate. They've violated their autonomy. They've taken on that ability to make decisions for their roommate. But notice, in this case, they did it for their roommate's own good. They weren't doing it to sort of help themselves. They were doing it to help their roommate. Similarly, there's a bad boyfriend example where imagine someone, they get this idea that they think your boyfriend is sort of bad for you, is a sort of bad influence, and it's causing you harm. And so they secretly sort of write a note and sign your name on it and give it to your sort of boyfriend in the hopes that they're going to sort of break things off with you. The idea is they're not doing this to help themselves. They don't have like a secret plan to sort of hook up with your boyfriend. They're doing this because they genuinely are concerned about your well-being. And so they have made the choice for you so as to improve your life for your own good. Even if it really is for your own good, it seems like we feel outrage at someone else taking control over our own life. Or consider an example not from the book. Consider the college parent that maybe tries to control exactly what their child is going to major in and what career they're going to go into. Imagine the sort of parents that try to pressure and maybe even using financial means and saying, look, I will help pay for your college, but only if you go to medical school and become a doctor. But what if this child doesn't want to be a doctor? What if they don't enjoy that? What if they just don't care about that? It looks as if the parents are trying to, and then again, a parent of a college student, so someone who is an adult, is no longer a child, is trying to make this choice. Even if the parent thinks that this is what's best for their sort of child, we still feel outrage at that other person trying to take control, sort of take the reins from us in that way. Now, the principle of humanity also justifies our sort of never abandoning hope in other people. The idea here is, and I'll just sort of mention this quickly because I don't think it's as maybe as motivating as some of the other ones, but a bad and even evil person has their own reason and autonomy. So there's always the chance that they would be able to use their reason and autonomy to change their character through their own free choices. Now, that might be hard and unlikely. I mean, we get in the habit of behaving in the ways that we do, and it's hard to break our habits. It's hard to change the kind of persons we are. But on this sort of view, we all have the ability to decide to change our ways, since we have the power to determine our own lives. The principle of humanity also provides a source of universal human rights. So there's an intuition that every person has certain fundamental basic human rights. So no matter who you are, it doesn't matter if you're the president or just a lonely philosophy professor. Doesn't matter if you are incredibly rich or a poor philosophy professor. It doesn't matter sort of where you fit in society. Every single human being seems to be worthy of a certain amount of sort of dignity and has a certain basic rights that everybody has to respect no matter who they are. We are all deserving of this minimum amount of respect from others. But the question becomes, why do we have such rights? Where do they come from? What grants us these moral rights? Kant can explain these as deriving from our power of rationality and autonomy. On Kant's views, these two powers are essential to living a meaningful life and are the source of a human being's value as a person. Every person is rational and autonomous to some degree, yet some might be more rational than others. Some might be more autonomous than others. But the idea is it looks as if we have at least some degree of rationality and autonomy, and that thereby makes us sort of grants us these certain human rights where others people have to respect that sort of reason and autonomy. Now, if this is the foundation for a valuable life, we thereby have a duty to respect and acknowledge that value in others. Now, notice this seems yet again better than consequentialism to some extent, because the consequentialists will say, what's the source of human rights? Well, the source is that respecting these, sort of giving people these rights leads to better consequences. But then the problem becomes, well, what about those situations like the organ harvesting case where respecting rights doesn't lead to better consequences? If human rights are only a means to an end, then when they don't help us achieve that end, then you don't have to respect human rights on the consequentialist view. But according to Kant, the value of a human life and those human rights that we have doesn't come from the consequences of sort of treating people with that kind of respect. It comes from the mere fact that that person has rationality and autonomy. The principle of humanity also provides a basis for moral responsibility. What I mean by this is we hold people responsible for the actions that they perform. We hold people responsible for their actions. So persons who perform morally good actions, they do the morally right thing, deserve praise. Perhaps they ought to be rewarded. So they deserve credit for their morally good actions. Persons who perform morally bad actions deserve blame, perhaps even punishment. It is, they also deserve credit for the actions that they've done, but they just deserve bad credit. So that we ought to blame them for doing that thing. Now, on Kant's view, the idea is the reason that it's appropriate to praise people for their good actions is because they perform that action, they make that choice through their own reason and autonomy. They are in control of that choice. And so if they're the one that's in control of the choice that they make, that thereby gives them makes them deserving of either praise when they choose to do a good thing or blame when they choose to do a morally wrong thing. Now notice, similarly, we do not hold animals morally responsible for their actions. So if a lion got loose at the zoo and killed, say, 3 people, now that's a very bad consequence, and we don't want it to happen. So obviously we would do something so to try to prevent that from happening again. We might even put the lion down. But the idea is we don't blame the lion in the same way we blame a person who kills 3 people, because the lion doesn't know what it's doing. The lion isn't in control. It's acting on these animal instincts. Whereas the person who picks up a gun and shoots 3 people, they know exactly what they're doing, and they decided to do it. That was within their control. They could have chosen not to do that. The connection between rationality and autonomy here is also embedded within the framework of the legal system that we have built. Now, our legal system is not perfect by any means whatsoever, but it's interesting to at least note that when we look at some of the things, at least some of the ideals that people have about the legal system, even if we don't live up to those ideals, seems to have these Kantian ideas built into them. So, for instance, think of the practice of punishing minors less than adults. If a minor and an adult commit the very same crime, and it's sort of the same morally wrong action, why would we think that a minor, a child, is less deserving of punishment or deserving of less severe punishment than the adult who committed the very same crime? Well, the reasoning seems to be that the child doesn't have as much rationality or autonomy. They aren't able to control their actions, so practice self-control as the adult is. In fact, there is some biological reasons to believe this. The part of the brain that seems responsible for allowing a person to practice self-control, to resist temptation, is in the prefrontal cortex. Now, that part of the brain is not fully developed until people are about, I think it's around 24 or 25 years old, maybe even later. But that seems to suggest that the younger people do not have the physical basis that thereby enables them to practice as much self-control. Now, they might be able to do it to a degree, but not to a full degree that a sort of adult would be able to do. And we thereby hold the adult more responsible. In fact, this was a big deal in the legal system because, as I said, notice, even at 18, that part of the brain is not fully developed. And there were a lot of discussions a few years back about whether or not we ought to revise the way we sort of think about the legal system regarding treating 18-year-olds as sort of adults for the purposes of the law. Also, notice there's the existence of the insanity defense. That is, when someone is suffering from a psychological disorder, that psychological disorder might sometimes be what ends up being in control of their actions and leads them to do various sort of what we think of as bad actions. But if it's their psychological disorder that's sort of in control of that action, it looks like we don't want to hold them as responsible as we would for a sort of fully sane, competent, rational person. All right, so that's it for the advantages. In the next video, we'll look at some of the disadvantages or worries that arise for the principle of humanity. See you then. Bye-bye.